Thank you so much, Connor. Everyone, welcome. Welcome to supporting Indigenous members at the bargaining table. I really do want to acknowledge that I'm in Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. You're welcome and strongly encouraged to share where you are and acknowledge the land you're on. The chat feature is open. I believe some people have already used it, but please, if you want to state it again, we are more than happy to bear witness. Thank you. This is a PSAC event, so I will be reading the anti-harassment statement. Thank you. Our union is made strong by members working together to improve our working lives and to preserve the rights that we have struggled to achieve. Mutual respect is the cornerstone of this cooperation. The PSAC Constitution confirms that every member, staff person, and non-staff support people, for example, technicians, interpreters, they are entitled to be free from discrimination and harassment in both the union and at the workplace on the basis of age, sex, color, national or ethnic origin, race, religion, marital status, family status, criminal record, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, language, social and economic class, or political belief. Members, staff, and non-staff support people are also entitled to be free from any psychological harassment. Content displayed or posted on this event platform, as well as any and all discussions on the platform, shall be respectful. Conflict in and of itself does not constitute harassment. Rather, harassment includes online bullying, content or language that is threatening, abusive, defamatory, obscene, indecent, or objectionable on the event platform and on any other related electronic network. To be clear, content or discussion of a racist, sexist, albiest, homophobic, transphobic, or otherwise discriminatory nature will not be tolerated or accepted. Content and discussion must not be offensive, graphically in tone or in nature. Should you experience harassment at this event, contact the identified anti-harassment resource person, which for this panel is Connor Spencer. You can discuss the situation. Early and informal resolution processes are strongly encouraged. Whenever possible, members are expected to engage in a respectful dialogue to resolve the matter. The anti-harassment resource person is available to facilitate this discussion. If this conversation is neither successful nor possible, the appropriate process as outlined in harassment policies, guidelines, collective agreements, and the Constitution, the Constitution and or regulations will be fully and quickly engaged. Harassment in all its forms detracts from the common purpose and weakens our union. May each one of us treat each other with kindness, compassion, dignity, and respect. I am pleased to welcome Chris Alward, Public Service Alliance Canada National President. Chris, to you for some opening remarks.
Merci, Lorraine. Bonjour tout le monde. Je vous divorce.
Thank you, Lorraine. Hello, everyone. I'd like to mention that I'm in Ottawa in the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people.
Joining us this evening, I especially want to thank Lorraine Russo and, of course, the PSAC staff who helped organize this evening's panel, and, of course, to our panelists who will talk about how we as a union can work together to advance Indigenous workers' rights at the bargaining table. While Indigenous History Month is coming to a close, our commitment to honor and learn about the achievements and history of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across Canada must continue year-round. For settlers and non-Indigenous organizations like our union, we must also continue to reflect on our history and commit to learn and unlearn each and every day. I want to express my sincere gratitude for the contributions of Indigenous PSAC members and staff who have helped guide our union's truth and reconciliation work. We are committed to decolonizing our processes and structures, and we will continue to make this a priority for our union, and that includes at the bargaining table. As we well know, discriminatory laws, policies, and actions on Indigenous peoples significantly impacted Indigenous languages. Many have been lost, and others at risk. Language is key to one's identity, and it's the means by which culture and its traditions or shared values are conveyed and preserved. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission includes calls to action on the protection and strengthening of Indigenous languages. And we must hold the government to account on these calls to action. And we must also, of course, look at where the government as an employer and other employers can take action to recognize Indigenous languages. In 2019, the government passed the Indigenous Languages Act, which was Bill C-91, recognizing the importance of preserving and promoting the use of Indigenous languages. In the last round of Treasury Board bargaining, the employer agreed to establish a joint committee to examine Indigenous language skills in the performance of employees' duties, among other things. This round of bargaining, we are demanding a new article for Indigenous Languages Allowance at $1,500 for members who use an Indigenous language in the workplace. There is currently a bilingual allowance for Canada's 2 official languages, and bilingualism is a skill that should be encouraged and recognized in the federal public service. And we want the bilingual bonus increase, but we're also insisting that this be extended to Indigenous languages. And I look forward, of course, to the discussion this evening. This round of bargaining, and I don't have to tell any of you, is critical for all of us, all 220,000 members of PSAC. Every employer that we deal with is currently looking and watching very carefully at this round of bargaining with Treasury Board. As you may well know, of course, that we've been in bargaining for this past year, for 12 months now, and we've seen absolutely no movement from the government on any of our demands at all. Their economic offer, of course, is nothing but a slap in the face and an insult to many of our members. So certainly this round of bargaining, again, we're asking everyone to be engaged and to help mobilize. I do want to just take a moment before handing it back to Lorraine to ensure that you are all aware of our Still Thirsty for Justice campaign. Earlier this month, in collaboration with Indigenous communities and in the spirit of reconciliation, our union launched our second campaign to demand safe, clean water for all and hold the federal government to account to keep their promises to end all long-term water advisories. Still Thirsty for Justice is a follow-up to our 2016 Thirsty for Justice campaign, which focused in partnership with Grassy Narrows, a community whose water supply has been contaminated with mercury and other pollutants for more than 50 years. Grassy Narrows is only one of hundreds of communities in Canada that doesn't have access to safe, clean water, and most of them are Indigenous communities or on First Nations reserves. Still Thirsty for Justice begins where our campaign left off, visiting the communities of Grassy Narrows and Salmon Creek, and broadening the picture of how the water crisis is impacting many others across Canada and the First Nations, including PSAC members. And I'm urging all of you to visit the PSAC website and to promote and support our Still Thirsty for Justice campaign. Thank you again for being here this evening. Lorraine, back to you.
Chris, thank you so much. Very, very inspiring. Thank you. As you may be aware, or you may not be, Lorraine Russo, Regional Executive Vice President for the North. I work with Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon Territory. And of course, I work for you. We've opened our event with a land acknowledgement. And thank you again, Chris. Yours was quite beautiful. Land acknowledgement is not a token statement and should never be a token statement. We're here today in this space virtually in the spirit of reconciliation and solidarity. At the end of this event, participants will have a chance to take part in a digital action in support of our demand for an Indigenous language allowance at Treasury Board tables. It's a fight worth fighting. The North presents victories when it comes to fighting for Indigenous rights, Indigenous rights at work, schools, and beyond. There's a lot of inspiration to be drawn from the North. Although the situation is far from perfect, the union and the labor movement gained victories. PSAC is grateful to the Indigenous workers and the communities for standing up for justice, as they've always done. We read this government statements all the time, supporting resilient Indigenous communities. Since when have Indigenous communities not been resilient? Indigenous communities have always been resilient, have always been strong, and we look to them for inspiration. I'm going to speak briefly about two recent gains at the bargaining table in Nunavut. Inuit language incentive policy is in place in Nunavut. And last year, a collective agreement was reached with the city of Iqaluit, increased language incentive pay based on proficiency in Inuktitut. Another example and a victory from Nunavut, a tentative agreement was reached with the government of Nunavut, and currently PSAC and Nunavut employees union teams are traveling to communities for ratification votes. The agreement broadened provisions on hunting, fishing, and harvesting leave. Holding space and honoring Indigenous languages and traditions is a vital, vital part of Truth and Reconciliation. Truth and Reconciliation calls to action 13 to 17. These address Indigenous languages and cultures. Indigenous rights include Indigenous language rights. I invite you all to download Truth and Reconciliation calls to action or have the handbook at your work or home. I carry this with me everywhere. Find out how many of the 94 calls of action are implemented in your city, province, territory, at work, schools, and beyond. PSAC members have always been at the front line when it comes to taking action. Regionally, we've launched a Lunata campaign that addresses food insecurity in remote northern communities. Nationally, a few weeks ago, as Chris has stated, we launched Still Thirsty for Justice, because hundreds of communities, the majority are Indigenous communities, still don't have access to safe, clean water. We can't repeat this enough. We can't repeat this action. If you have not taken action yet, I invite you to visit www.lunata.ca and, of course, it's already in the chat, I believe, www.stillthirstyforjustice.ca. We have a strong voice. We do. And we must use this voice to fight for change at work environments, schools, public services, and beyond. In the labor movement, the bargaining table is our most powerful tool for fighting for change. I mentioned a few of the gains that strong bargaining teams were able to achieve in Nunavut. But we have got a long way to go to both at those tables and at our southern tables. Today, I'm honored to be in the presence of great speakers and tireless workers' rights and social justice advocates, who they will share their experiences and knowledge on how we can support Indigenous workers at the bargaining table. Our first speaker from our panel is Michael Freeman. Michael has been an active union member for 24 years. He has been the president of Local 00128 for 21 years, has been the Union of National Employees Equity Representative for persons with disabilities for the last 8 years. And this is his 6th round as a EB bargaining team member. Michael, welcome. Please, to you.
Thanks, Lorraine, and hello to everybody that joined us tonight. We appreciate that you came here. I come to you, I'm speaking from my living room in Hagersville, which is right next door to the reserve from which I spring, and that's the Six Nations Reserve in Southern Ontario. It is the home of the Haudenosaunee people. We have 6 nations that make up our the title Six Nations. I work at one of the schools there. We have 5 schools and about 1,200 students. We are the largest reserve in Canada by population, but we are one of the smallest by land area. Why is the Indigenous Languages Allowance important to the members? I was taught years ago, long ago, when I started becoming active for the union, that an injury to one is an injury to all. I wholeheartedly believe that. And it follows from that that the demand of one is the demand of all. If it's important to one, we should be arguing on behalf of that one so that we can achieve what they need in the collective agreement. Any demand that is achieved and included in the collective agreement is progress for some, and therefore is progress for all. When one wins, we all win on some level. So it's not only important to the local membership, for the members on the reserves, Six Nations in Tyendinaga and Cold Lake, Alberta, which are the last 3 remaining reserves that have federal jurisdiction over education, but it's important to all of our members. Why is the Indigenous Languages Allowance important to me personally? I have been an activist for a long time. I fought for the rights of Aboriginal people and other marginalized equity-seeking groups throughout my union activism. And also in my personal life, as a disabled person, I've had many hurdles to climb over. The Indigenous Language Allowance is the current struggle that I am trying to assist the membership and our union to achieve into the collective agreement. And for whatever reason, the federal government seems to be dragging their feet. There are other issues that I have participated in along the way. When we had the no discrimination fight for the language in our collective agreements to include gender identity and expression, that was at the EB table 5 rounds ago. We had pay equity questions at the EB table, and we tried to get those resolved 6 rounds ago. We had the no consanguinity clause that added 1 day for bereavement leave, and that was from 3 rounds ago. And, you know, when that came out and the news took hold of it, they laughed. They said idiotic things like, look, they want a bereavement leave for an invisible friend. So they have no respect for Aboriginal culture. And for this fight, they have no respect for Indigenous languages at all. And we all remember the fight from a few rounds ago in defense of our sick leave. The Indigenous Language Allowance is very important to the membership of my local and the membership of the other 2 locals in Canada. As I mentioned, the federal government systematically attempted to strip away everything and anything Indian. The languages, the culture, the family connection, the connection to the land, the history, oral tradition, absolutely everything. They tried to take it away. My grandfather was brutalized in schools on the reserve just for speaking his own language, Tuscarora. He was a hereditary chief. He was a sitting member in 1924 when the federal government said that you can't have traditional council anymore. He spoke all of the 6 Haudenosaunee languages, and he never taught his children nor his grandchildren any of it. And I think it all stems from how he was treated when he was in the schools that were there to educate the Indian. What a resource that we lost in him. What a legacy lost. A disconnect was created by the policies of the Canadian government at that time. They severed the line. There were 139 residential schools in Canada over the life of the residential system. To date, the grounds of 11 have been searched. 128 left to go. And the estimate is 10,000 graves have been found. 10,000 graves. The Indigenous Language Allowance is an opportunity for the Canadian government to begin to make reparations, to own up to their dastardly past, and to honor the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was given the opportunity to speak at the table, which is unusual for those that don't know what bargaining is all about. But I was asked to speak on this exact demand. And I emphasized that instead of dragging your feet, you should be jumping at the opportunity to play a role in not only truth and reconciliation, but repairing the relationship and also helping to lay the groundwork so that Aboriginal languages can become what they once were, which is everyday common use within many of the families. What has been the response of Treasury Board? I alluded to it. During the last round of bargaining, this demand was one of the last to be dealt with at the table. And that was because Treasury Board didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to include it. And we had to hold our ground and force them. Treasury Board argued the language of the MOU. They right down to simple words that were being put in there. They wanted to guide the ship so that they could temper the impact that they feel from having to work on the MOU. They were reluctant to include language pertaining to the demand. They were reluctant to strike a committee, and their side of the table has grown in number, and some changes in key positions were made, which means we question their seriousness as to how they want to proceed. What has been the response of the Indigenous Languages Committee? It's made up of representatives of Treasury Board. It's made up of representatives of PSAC. And quite honestly, there's been a lot of work that has been done. One person on the Treasury Board side was given the bulk of the duties. Thank you for doing that work. The original union demand got lost, though, in the project that Treasury Board embarked on. They sought answers to questions outside the scope of the MOU. Information was sought from the department, some that didn't even have employees that are members of the EB table, the PA table, or, I'll drop that there. And then there were delays and delays and delays. We were set to wrap it up by this date, and then it was extended, and that date got extended. And when the final report was written, it was broader than the MOU, and it had no conclusions and no recommendations. The original MOU intention seems to have been hijacked by the Treasury Board agenda. The final report leaves us wondering where we go from here. What has been the government's response? Well, why aren't the politicians jumping all over this demand and insisting or even directing Treasury Board to settle this demand? They could play a very vital role in demanding that Treasury Board sit down seriously and look at this demand and state that it's important to them, not only important to us. Why do they not see this as a positive and necessary step toward reconciliation? It is a necessary step. What would be the impact of winning or achieving this demand? It would be one way that the Stephen Harper apology would actually mean something. So far, it has been hollow words without action. It would show that the truth and reconciliation calls to action are actually going to be acted upon and not just another expensive document sitting on a dusty shelf. It would mean that all of those teachers that use their talents as a regular part of their job will be compensated for it. The federal government has been exploiting their talents for years. I wasn't going to share this part, but when I was growing up at number 7 school in the 70s, I received 1/2 hour of language training in Mohawk every week, 1/2 hour. I don't know anybody who can achieve fluency in a language when you're being taught 1/2 hour in your language. And when in the 80s, we said that our schools are subpar, it took the community to stand up against the federal government, and the union stood beside them. The community put in a picket line saying, we're not allowing our children to go to those schools anymore. You have to build us new ones. And the federal government, the PSAC membership stood beside them and said, we're not crossing community picket lines. Union members don't cross picket lines. And in their wisdom, the federal government came down and they said, if you don't cross, we're going to fire out all of you. And thank goodness the president of the local at the time replied and said, start filling out pink slips then, because we're not crossing. We ended up getting some new schools in the 90s, and it included immersion classes. And we keep developing from there. So there's ways that we can reinvigorate the languages for Aboriginal people. We are doing it locally. But now it's time to recognize that people have been doing that for years, that have been sharing of their talents for years. And they should be compensated just like somebody who has a specialist in math or in science or in reading or in writing. But right now they don't. It would mean that the federal government is attempting to right the wrongs imposed and enforced through federal policy and acts of parliament. They were the ones that set in place all of those negative things that attacked Aboriginal people and tried to strip everything away from them. Some call it a genocide. I'm not sure that I disagree with them. It would mean that the federal government is finally entering into that respectful relationship that the wampum signified all those years ago. The Indigenous Languages Allowance is very important to me, to my membership at my local, to those members at the schools, and to many, many members across Canada. And I hope that we can find a way to force them being the government, them being Treasury Board, to come on board with our way of thinking, because it's very important, and they should see that granting this demand or accepting this demand would be a win for them too. Thank you for letting me speak to you this evening.
Michael, thank you so, so much. So very, very appreciated. I hear you loud and clear, and I am so grateful and honored that you shared that with us. Thank you.
Anytime. I appreciate the opportunity.
Our next speaker is Ray Wilson. Ray Wilson, with his birth mother Mohawk from Six Nations, Ontario, and his birth father from Rice Lake Reserve near Peterborough, Ontario. Ray was adopted into a middle-class suburban family in 1966. Like many of that generation, 60 scoop, he lost the day-to-day connection with his birth family. He attended Sioux College, where he studied forestry and geology. He is a Public Service Alliance Canada member and has now worked for the Government of Canada for 32 years in positions that have always had an Indigenous component to them. He has a keen interest in Indigenous issues, both in the government workplace, both in the government workplace and across the country in general. Ray, pleased to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And thank you, everybody. I'm coming to you from Treaty 7, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and I am honored to be speaking to you from their territory. I'm going to kind of go all over the place because, as Lorraine mentioned, I didn't grow up in an Indigenous community. I didn't have ties to an Indigenous family. So all of my early years were, I knew where Six Nations was. It was about 30 miles west of where I was living. I knew it was a large Indigenous community, but that was about it. And as much as my parents tried, one or two trips out to Six Nations a year didn't really immerse one into the culture. And so it wasn't until I got older and, in all honesty, joined PSAC and the Government of Canada that I became much more aware of Indigenous issues. And unfortunately, most of the Indigenous issues were not good ones. And it's sad to say that, you know, as someone who started his career in the late 70s, and now we're talking in 2022, as I said to Connor when we were talking earlier, not a whole lot has changed. And that's really sad. When I listened to Michael speak about language, one of the big concerns when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was touring the country was how quickly we are losing our Indigenous languages. And we're going to get to a point where we're not going to have those anymore because, you know, as our members, you know, move on, that gets lost. And it seems like Treasury Board is almost willing to just drag their heels and you know, procrastinate for as long as they can, and then they don't have to deal with it. You know, when I look at things that we could be doing or would make things, you know, more amenable to Indigenous people looking at the government of Canada as a career. You know, I'll reference an incident that happened in 1999 when I came out to Lethbridge. I came out to participate in a 2-year program as a research technician. It was an Indigenous program. So the first half was paid for by Agriculture, Ag Food Canada. Second half was paid for by, at that time, Indian Northern Affairs. And the idea was to find Indigenous employees that we could use to participate with projects on Indigenous communities. Really good idea, really good program. But when I came out here to sign the contract, I was given a choice between taking an oath on the Bible or swearing an oath of allegiance to the Queen. And my question to the person who was administering this oath was, well, I don't want to do either of those. So what's a third option? And the reply I got back was, the third option is that you don't do either and you don't get the job. So I said, okay, that's not a really good option. And, but, you know, there's merit in the position. So if I remember right, I swore an oath on the Bible with a hand behind my back and fingers crossed. So that was kind of my way of saying, sure, I'll say it, but, you know, it's not good. Why can we not have a traditional eagle feather in every building that can be used for Indigenous employees to take their oath on? It's one of the highest symbols of our culture right across the country. And government buildings should be acknowledging this. This is an important piece of our heritage. And if you're asking Indigenous people to come in and become members of your working community, then let's start showing respect right off the bat. You know, don't make them swear an oath on a Bible that, for most of our members, somebody in their family probably had a very different experience with that Bible. Same thing with oath to the Queen. I have an Irish mother who is very, very, you know, tied to the monarchy, and we have issues because I look at the monarchy and I just see all of the damage that was done. And again, you're asking Indigenous members to swear an oath of allegiance to somebody that caused more damage to their communities and to their families. So right off the bat, let's do something that respects our Indigenous communities and makes our Indigenous members feel like they're coming into a place that is inclusive, which is one of the biggest buzzwords that we've heard in the last I don't know how many years, whether it's from Parliament, whether it's from, the Prime Minister, um, you know, everybody knows the word inclusive. So how come we're not being inclusive right off the bat? That's something that we need to fix. And as a union, when we attend Indigenous meetings, we invite everybody, and we acknowledge where they come from. We acknowledge the land that we're meeting on, and everybody is given an opportunity to speak. Unfortunately, when you come into our government workplaces, that's not the case at all, and we need to change that. So step one, getting people in the door, respecting them right off the bat. Step two, why do we not acknowledge traditional events, traditional days? For example, out here in the Blackfoot community, Sundance is a very important time in their year. But in the science community or in the government community, that's not recognized at all. And we have members who have big parts to play in Sundance. It's a family event, it's a community event, and it has been that way since time began. So we need to look at how we do things differently. And for our Indigenous members, one of the things that we need to look at is respecting that time frame and that event as something equivalent, as I mentioned to someone in conversation. We get Christmas off, we get Boxing Day, we get New Year's Day. Our Jewish members get Hanukkah. Our Muslim community can celebrate Ramadan. I don't know of anybody that has gotten time off for Sundance unless they took it as personal leave. That's wrong. Why are we excluding the very people that we want to try and encourage to come into our community? So we need to acknowledge these days and respect that they are just as important to them as Christmas would be to Christians, or Hanukkah would be to our Jewish members. If we're talking about inclusiveness and being fair to all, then let's really be fair to all. Let's not say, yeah, you can have the day off, but you've got to use it as a vacation day. That's not fair, and that's not right. Where else can we go? Traditional families, very different, and again, we need to acknowledge that there are times where Indigenous members, have family responsibilities that they need to attend to. So this is a case where you would have to take personal leave, but it should be allowed, because the traditional family is different, and there are responsibilities on all Indigenous members to their families. We need to acknowledge that as well. Someone just put up a note about June 21st. I've always looked at June 21st as one of those days where it's mixed emotions for me, because it's nice that we're acknowledging Indigenous Day, but it's sad that it's only one day when you look at how long we've been here. So shouldn't it be something more than just a day? And similar to what provinces do for all of their all of the people who live in that province, where you get a day in either August or February. Why can our federal government not recognize that and say, like, if we're going to do this, let's do it right? And again, it's a day that should just be on the books as Indigenous Day. You shouldn't have to take it off as personal time, as personal leave. It's your day. And we need to acknowledge that. Another area that we need to look at, and this is going to go back to language as well, and just some of the titles that we use in the government. As Lorraine mentioned, I've 30 plus years in working for the federal government, 4 different departments, one of which was Indian Northern Affairs, and the actual program that I was working on was a program called Indian Minerals. There was an East Division and a West Division, and they couldn't come up with a better title because they just didn't ask any Indigenous person, what would be a better name for this? The job was looking at aggregate and natural resources on Indigenous communities and trying to find ways to see if we could develop those. But right there, Indian Minerals just says to me, we have no respect for the communities that we're working in. It was a good program. It was a great program. But the title, you're going out to talk to Indigenous communities and you've got a business card that says Indian Minerals on it. That's not a good look. And again, coming back to language, when we do go out and talk to Indigenous communities, because especially working in the research community, which I've done for most of my career, when we go out to talk to communities about partnering and looking at research opportunities on their communities, it would be nice to have somebody who could speak the language of the people that we're going to talk to. Going out to send an English-speaking Mohawk who can't speak a single word of Mohawk to talk to a Blackfoot band and council, it's not really a good thing. So again, this is where language becomes so important. In the 20 plus years that I've been out here in Alberta, if there was incentive for me to learn Blackfoot as part of my job, that would have been huge. We could have made some really significant inroads in that community because it would show that we're trying. It would show that, instead of just saying words or, just platitudes, we're actually trying really hard. And again, as someone just mentioned with elders, when you listen to elders speak, there's a dignity, there's life experience there. And it would be nice to treat them with the respect by being able to speak to them in their language. It always amazes me when you go out and you're watching little kids and they're speaking in their own language, and then just as quickly they turn around, they can speak to you in English and then right back to their friends in whatever language they're speaking again. It's huge to keep that skill and that talent going. So that's another area that we need to look at. One of the other things that we need to do as a union, and we're trying. There's certainly a big push out here in Southern Alberta, but is to start going out and talking to the schools, public schools, high schools, showing the Indigenous communities that the government could be a viable place of employment if we were able to do things a little bit better. And that's where PSAC comes in, because as you've all read and heard through just this evening, so many of the programs that PSAC is involved in focus on all of the concerns that came up in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And all of those are extremely important to our Indigenous communities. But if you step aside and take a look, we've got a lot of other communities in the country that have water issues, that have food sustainability issues. So if the PSAC, if we can, do this for our Indigenous communities, that'll show the public that we could do this for anybody. Because one thing the PSAC has, as I'm sure most of you who are attending, one thing the PSAC has is it's got strength. it's got strength beyond what the average person knows. And that's one of the things that, you know, has always been so prevalent in our Indigenous communities. When you look at what we've gone through, and I'm using the royal we there, and I know I shouldn't use the word royal either, but when you look at what we've gone through in the last 200 to 300 years, we're still here. And we're not going anywhere, because regardless of how many treaties have been broken, this is still our land. This is still our home. This is where we belong. And, you know, the PSAC has done a very good job of taking on these causes and representing our members. And we as members need to support them as much as we can, because this is a huge, huge battle. And that is the correct word, folks. It is a battle. And it's going to continue to be a battle until we get to the point where we're equal. And right now, we're not. And that's one of the things, again, that PSAC has always been very good about is, you know, we've got great leaders that, and we've got great members who, for whatever reason, they love being the underdog, and they love a good fight. And this is one that, you know, if we want to get the Indigenous communities to look at the government as I said, as a place of viable employment, then we've got to make some changes in how the government recognizes our Indigenous members, and start treating them with the respect that they deserve. And, you know, something as simple as, don't make me swear an oath to, you know, an organization that has caused so much damage to my family and to my communities. You know, respect our traditions, use our traditions, and more importantly, ask what our traditions are. Ask what we could put into a collective agreement that would make our members feel more welcome. Because then, you know, if they're made to feel welcome, you might actually get more people looking to come in the door. That'll do for now, I think, Lorraine.
Ray, thank you so very much. You're opening our eyes even further. You're placing unacceptable practices in a perspective that is understandable. You know, and I will just speak to one point before we move on. Having or forcing nations or forcing peoples to beg for one national Indigenous Day as a statutory holiday across a land called Canada, it is so unacceptable. It's so horrifying. And I will stop there. My apologies to everyone. Ray, again, thank you so very much. Miigwech. Hi. Our next panelist, his name is Matthew. So Matthew, I'm going to pronounce your last name, and please, my sincerest apologies if I mangle a little bit. Matthew Niuk. Matthew is a Parks Canada member in Pengerton, yay, Pengerton, who was on the Indigenous Language Committee with Public Service Rights Canada, Treasury Board, and Parks Canada. Matthew, I'm going to turn to you, but I do ask if you could just expand a little bit, if you could tell us for a few minutes about your involvement in the fight for recognition of Indigenous languages in the public service. Matthew, please.
Hello, Nuku.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Did we have a translator for Inuit?
Yes, translation is happening. So if you choose to speak in Inuit.
Okay, so how can I can't hear her. So I just want to know when to stop for him or her to translate?
Interpretation is simultaneous. Just speak slow and consistent, and it won't be a problem. She'll just be behind by a sentence or two.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthew Nauyok. I'm from Panoktok in Nunavut. I work with Parks Canada here in Panoktok. I'm not a manager, but I'm currently just a regular employee of Parks Canada, a member. I'd like to say at this point, if you did not understand a particular point that I might make, I'll switch languages. I'm a young person, per se. My first language is Inuktitut.
My mother tongue. Ago koliungatani laktu kallunatitu iligia kalilok.
It's been a number of years since I had to learn the language of English, about 9-10 years. And I had to make a real effort to learn English. It was a struggle for me. I have 2 children. I have a son, 5-year-old son. I have a daughter. She is 12 years old. I could say both of them speak fluent in Inuktitut. But I could tell you at this stage in my daughter's life at 12 years old, she's learning a lot of English. My wife speaks Inuktitut. It was her first language, and she's just learning to speak English. I could tell you in our home, we always speak in Inuktitut. We don't speak any English at all. I could tell you we have a conversation in our home. It's always in Inuktitut, so we get them.
They don't speak English.
My father is a fisherman and a harvester. Every time he is at the end of his fishing, he has to get some paperwork done with the federal government. And there's nobody at all in the office who don't speak any English. Well, Inuktitut. I'm either myself or another family member always has to assist him. Every time he needs to fill out forms for the federal government, there's always no help whatsoever. So I'm always having to pitch in to help him or somebody from the family. It's the same case for my mother. Every time she wants to order something from the south, I have to assist her. So we act as interpreters for her every time they need to deal with ordering or any other matters. Let's say banking. Whenever they need to open an account, there's no Inuktitut service available. So they always rely on myself or another family member to assist them in these day-to-day tasks that I feel is something we use on a day-to-day basis. Like we speak in Inuktitut daily, it's like that's the same thing. It seems to be missing for that service to be available. It's not just my parents. It's a lot of people in Nunavut that don't have access to services in English and Inuktitut. Well, they have access to English, but the service is missing to provide that accessible language institute. I could tell you I've been with the Parks Canada for over 20 years, about 20 years.
Indigenous Language Allowance.
And I want to speak a little bit about the Indigenous Language Allowance. For those of us that are participant with the union in Nunavut, I could say that how come that we cannot access the same benefits that the government of Nunavut provide to their workers? And so if the government of Nunavut can provide equitable benefits such as a language benefit to their staff, how come we can't do that at the federal level? And it's like at the beginning, we got excited to hear that there might possibly be a language benefit for staff, but it's dragged on for so long that our excitement levels have kind of faltered a little bit because we don't know if it'll ever happen. But we have to work together to achieve this goal of benefiting everybody, because this will benefit not just Inuit, but it'll also benefit other Aboriginal language employees, so that within their workplace, they can also access this benefit. It's not just for Inuit. In our working environment, Inuktitut is a language that we use on a daily basis. We always speak Inuktitut on a daily basis. And so we try to provide that service to anyone that comes in. So we speak in our language, and we speak to our fellow staff in Inuktitut. Also, if the Inuit unilingual individuals come in, I'm the one that has to provide service to provide the interpreting to the manager. So we don't have Inuktitut speaking managers, and have to provide a service of translation. I like to welcome everybody. It's something that is part of our culture, so we want to welcome them, ensure that they have that access to language, even if it's basic service of ensuring that they get to the questions they have answered and it's in their language. So it just even that part of that is like welcoming. So we want to be welcoming of anyone. Our board members are many.
Within the committee, there are unilingual Inuktitut speakers.
And the agenda that they have and is set, and then the meetings take place, and then we're able to speak in Inuktitut. But then again, when the Inuktitut is happening, we also have to be there to provide a service of ensuring that communication is happening, so that we can ensure the nuances of how people are trying to communicate their issues are happening, and then we step up to provide that service so that we fill that gap. Even if the service of translation is there, we want to ensure that we're there as well to provide the extra benefit of ensuring, are we on the same page? We speak to clients each day in Inuktitut.
We work in our workplace in related to Inuktitut. It's not within our job descriptions, but we deal with them in day-to-day basis.
Our fellow staff at Parks Canada, whenever there's French service, Parks Canada already provides a language allowance for English to French or French to English. And there's very little service that is required to provide the French language, but they do receive a French language benefit while we're working enormously a larger amount of time in ensuring that the service is offered in Inuktitut to English or vice versa. And so there seems to be an inequity there in providing equitable services to our clients. So we want to ensure that bilingual and unilingual speakers, particularly the unilingual speakers, are provided the access to our programs, and whether they have questions about any particular policies or anything that relate to Parks Canada, we want to ensure that they are getting the service. My wife, who speaks Inuktitut, also has to fill in and step up at her workplace within the government of Nunavut to ensure that the service is being offered in Inuktitut and English in both languages. However, there seems to be an inequity happening in the gap between the government of Nunavut employees and then the employees that fall under the PSAC or the federal government. So we're finding that it's inequitable. And so we aren't getting any kind of a language benefit. And so that's sad. I'm sad to hear that. So it would be nice to get that. I'm going to end there for now. But I want to say thank you so much for allowing me to participate and sharing some of my thoughts. I'll end there. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so very much. It was so beautiful hearing your language as your first language. I know many of us took great joy in being able to hear it, and your words resonate quite strongly with us. You know, having to consistently ask for help every time when you're living in your traditional territory where your first language is not even being recognized, to be able to get services within your community. Our hearts hurt. We will continue fighting the fight to be able to have the recognition that you need in your community and that we should be able to see. Matthew, thank you once again. You're so very appreciated. We will be moving on to our next speaker, our fourth speaker, Denise Hampton. So Denise Hampton, she's currently the Regional Education Officer in the Atlantic region of the Public Service Alliance Canada, with ancestors in the soil of Africville, my apologies, I'm very sorry, and Sabiga Nagidi First Nation. Their legacy guides her work for social and racial justice. She has spent her entire working life as a labor educator, advocating for workers and fighting for justice. Her education work is a direct extension of anti-bigotry, anti-colonist, pro-feminist, and climate justice work that she has been doing in her union and community. Denise, a very warm and big welcome. Please take the mic.
Thanks, Lorraine. I am not sure how I am going to follow those three phenomenal co-panelists to whom I raise my hands, and I want to thank them right up front for their words and their wisdom and their spirit. And I'm going to ask that my ancestors guide me in my words today, because even though it's not Friday, my friends will know that on Friday we have Real Talk. So today's Tuesday, so it's Real Talk Tuesday. And I'm going to offer some thoughts on what's next and what the union can continue to do in bargaining and improving on language rights, and in some cases bargaining language rights in places where we don't have any. But I unfortunately can't escape my life as an educator. And so I thought that it was really important to talk to you about why this is important. If we are unable to clearly explain why it's important to other members, to our family, to members of the community, then it's going to take us twice as long to get to where we want to be. And so my hope is that my remarks will help you when talking to other members of the union in particular, and therefore get us our goal. And I want to start by saying that those on both sides of the bargaining table have to understand the underlying reasons why language issues are so important. The effects of 530 years of colonialism can be found in every aspect of our society. I always say it's like water on concrete. And dismantling these effects will take some time, and they have to be undertaken thoughtfully and with care. It was only 25 very short years ago. Raise your hand if you are over 25. It was only 25 short years ago that the last Indian residential school was closed in this country. And these are places where children were tortured when they spoke the languages of their ancestors, the languages of their parents, the languages of their community. Michael's dad's story is not unique. That's not a unique story that he tells. It's a horrifying story, but it's not a unique story. It is very, very common in our communities. It is remarkable to me the various ways that people can find to torture other people. I also think it's fair to say that a majority of Canadians only realized the true horrors of these institutions about a year ago. The rest of us knew. Our elders told us. Our elders certainly knew, but most Canadians only found out about these things about a year ago. And in these past 12 months, there has been a barrage of education and historical accounts that Canadians have also been learning about. And I think it's very fair to say that we, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people living in Canada, have been extremely patient. But our patience is wearing thin. And it's time that dismantling colonialism takes a front seat, along with other issues at the bargaining table, the way that maternity benefits did, or health and safety in our workplaces, or workplace harassment, or pensions have done over the years. Strong language rights and building that into our collective bargaining process is one way to do this. It's one way to begin dismantling colonialism. What the union needs to keep in mind is that in the past, and sometimes the very recent past, the union, and not just PSAC, many unions across Turtle Island, have been a contributor to the oppression of Indigenous people. Perhaps not actively or deliberately, but they were a contributor nonetheless. There have been times when Indigenous people have been exclusively written out of collective agreements. I've seen collective agreements where we have been exclusively written out, or sometimes we're just ignored. And there have been times when collective agreements have been outright hostile to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit workers. But those days are over. Asserting our culture, our language, and our history is going to be a fact of life in unions for a long time to come. And unions should get used to this. Unions can't be neutral in their support of Indigenous workers. And because we have so much catching up to do, it means that we have to be especially aggressive in our pursuit of justice and reparations. And bargaining language rights is one crucial step on that long pursuit. In addition to some of the others, Ray, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to take your idea and include it in my presentation on decolonizing our collective agreements. I always want good ideas. When we talk about decolonizing and making gains for Indigenous workers, there are three things that I recommend that we stop doing and three things that we should start doing. First, We should stop replicating, mirroring, or emulating government systems. Ray gave us a perfect example of what that looks like, emulating government systems, right? Placing our hand on a Bible or swearing allegiance to the Queen. We should stop doing that and stop requiring that we do that. The federal government in this country is built on a regime of colonialism, and trying to emulate that simply upholds that colonial system that was built on white supremacy. The second thing we should stop doing is stop expecting Indigenous people to do all the hard work from the sidelines. Meaningful consultation involves a bunch of listening and lots of action, including Métis, Inuit, and First Nations members at the table shows a willingness to make space. And I don't want to hear, oh, well, they didn't run for the position, or we don't have room for an additional person in that space. Those kinds of comments are not helpful. They're disingenuous, they're false. It's also mean-spirited and extraordinarily colonialist. The third thing to stop is to stop performing. Performance belongs in the theater. Performance belongs on a stage. It does not belong in the union, unless you're starting a union choir. We've heard the expression ally is a verb. This is what this means. It means that if you have to announce your allyship on a regular basis, it probably means you're doing a lot less of the work and expecting a bunch of the praise. We see you. When you're with us, we see you and we know that you're with us. We carry you in our prayers. We carry you with us in our hearts. We lay tobacco for you. We perform ceremony for you. We celebrate you. And we hope that you feel that. We know that you're with us. But declaring that on a regular basis and expecting some sort of, I don't know, participation medal, is that what the kids call them now? That's not cool. It's just not cool. Three things that we can start doing, that unions, the labor movement, PSAC can start doing, are studying the TRC report. Lorraine alluded to it earlier. Really study them and find other calls to action that the union could implement or that could be included in bargaining demands, and then implement them. Call to action 57 is the one that's most pointedly directed at members of PSAC. But the others have importance and relevance in collective bargaining as well. We don't pay enough attention to the others. There are sections on language and culture and health, and even sports could be included in collective agreements. Calls 67 to 70 regarding museums and archives have the potential to impact workplaces where PSAC members are. And imagine the powerful message that you would send if you tabled calls 79 to 83 on commemoration and bargain them into your collective agreement. I know people, I can't see any of you, but I know you're frantically making notes. So I said 67 to 70 and 79 to 83. I know that collective bargaining has been traditionally about making primarily monetary gains in the workplace. We all want that. But PSAC is in a unique position. It bargains directly with the federal government, the same institution that created Indian residential schools and made the Truth and Reconciliation Commission necessary. PSAC should lead the labor movement in holding that government to account, using the 94 calls to action to do so. Reconciliation means taking your corner of this country, big or small, and changing that corner, decolonizing that corner. The second thing to start doing is to learn and to teach. We all know that the best way to build solidarity is if people have a vested interest in doing so. This will not be achieved if your members don't know why it's important, why it matters. And learning about things like the Eskimo identification tag system, or the widespread slaughter of sled dogs by the RCMP and the Quebec Provincial Police between 1950 and 1975, or the history of the first known reserve and its connection to the transatlantic slave trade, or the connection between pablum and the Hospital for Sick Children and Indian hospitals. These are all things that when we learn about, it creates a better understanding about why language rights are so important, why the restoration of culture is so important, and negotiating these things in the collective agreement is a first step. If we have learned nothing this past year, we've learned that what we have taught is lacking at best and outright false at worst. Help your members to learn. Senator Sinclair taught us that education is the thing that got us into this mess, and education is the only thing that will get us out. Third, and maybe most importantly, is to understand that our society is rooted in and built on a legacy of colonialism. I said earlier, it's like water on concrete. What that means is that it's in every crack and crevice and not easy to remove, but we must try. I'm not happy living in a country where the architects of genocide are celebrated, or where systems that disadvantage people based on race continue, or where harmful systems and institutions are permitted to go unchallenged. Remember that whenever somebody is disadvantaged, it usually means somebody is gaining an advantage, a privilege. And those people that benefit from those privileges will not give them up easily. The union has to stand with Indigenous members, not only when it's easy, like in the month of June or on September 30th, but also when it's hard, like when we demand reparations from religious institutions, or when we defend our land rights. This past June 21st marked 10,000 days, 10,000 days that Neskantaga First Nation doesn't have clean water. 10,000 days. It's where PSAC members live and work. I started my remarks by saying that we've been patient. And I should correct that and say our communities have been patient. My friends always tease me because I'm not patient. I'm very impatient. Patience is not one of the 7 sacred teachings, and I believe that this is true for a reason. We have been patient for 530 years. And I tried to think of something wise to say about patience, but I couldn't find anything. I couldn't think of anything. So I'm going to close by paraphrasing somebody else. He said, "For years now, we have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every First Nations person, every Inuit person, every Métis person seeking justice with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. 530 years of brutality, stolen children, stolen language, stolen culture, and genocide. How much longer do you expect us to patiently wait?" I raise my hands once again to all of my fellow panelists and to those that asked me to be here today. I say wialem, I say miigwech, I say thank you, and I say merci. You're on mute, Lorraine.
Sorry, I just need a second there. Denise, thank you so very much. I was jumping out of my seat. I was ready to cry. But you know, I'm inspired, and we can't wait. We can't. Tonight, we have an opportunity. People who are registered, individuals who are participating tonight, you can stick around and do an action. We have that plan for this evening. The next person I'll be introducing to you will have full instructions. Denise, Ray, Matthew, Michael, to all of our speakers of truth, our gratitude is so great. And we're humbled by your words. We're honored by your attendance. And on behalf, and I am going to say this, on behalf of all of Public Service Alliance Canada, we say thank you so very much. I do have to move on to the next portion. I'm just going to remind participants, please take these words with you. Please hear, please understand the truth. Our eyes are open. We're going to accept the truth, and that leads us down the path of reconciliation. Indigenous languages, we can't unfairly treat peoples anymore. We can't, and we can do something about it. Okay, so our next speaker, and I'm very, again, honored to be even a bit of this event tonight and help facilitate. We are going to speak with Sharon De Sosa, the Public Service Alliance Canada's National Executive Vice President. Sharon, I'm going to ask you to speak. Thank you so very much, everyone.
And thank you very much, Lorraine, for moderating this panel, and to all the panelists. We've heard a lot about the important discussion from this panel. And you know what? It's great discussion, but it's time to take action. And I'm so excited to join you for today's action for an Indigenous Language Allowance. We're continuing to build on some great momentum, and we need to continue to keep the pressure on. Now, we're going to do a short digital phone message action with members from across the country to support our demands for an Indigenous language allowance. And